lots of ways siblings being called on by teachers at school to come down and help their younger sibling who maybe was having difficulty in the school. And so they're getting pulled out of their educational setting to help mentor and help their sibling cope. So we wanted to really put our siblings in the middle. Now, from my perspective, there's almost no literature on it. Now, from my perspective, there's almost no literature on this, can we say? And so again, for me as a clinician, there's not a lot of data I can draw on for best practice. And so the first literature I looked at is the chronic illness literature, just a couple of highlights. The column on the right there, this was a meta-analysis of 51 studies that were out there with all different illness groups: epilepsy, cystic fibrosis, diabetes, lots of different kind of chronic illnesses, and it was sort of a mixed group. And they found in general, siblings, healthy siblings of a child with a chronic illness have higher rates of depression and anxiety than peers with healthy siblings, and those rates are about 4 times higher than someone who's growing up where all the kids in the family are neurotypical. Peer activities and cognitive development scores are lower in siblings. And the illnesses that have the biggest impact are those that affect daily functioning. So interestingly, although most of our studies are in cancer, for cancer we tend to see the family buckle down, push through, and there's an end in sight. And those families actually sometimes do better than our families that have. And what I liken it to is it's like going on a hike with a pebble in your shoe, is that every step, every day kind of rubs, right? And so you see someone carrying the boulder of cancer and lots of support is rallying because it's short term and it's crisis. But what that pebble in your shoe doesn't go away and others don't see it as well, and it starts to kind of wear, right? So while the initial news presents a population that's at risk, it's modified by lots of things. How cohesive is the family? How much control does the child have? How much flexibility is in the family? What's the age of the child at birth? Then the other thing that was striking in the chronic illness literature is that actually parents and siblings in lots of chronic illness groups are at more risk than the child who's ill him or herself. So again, in cancer, 41% of moms and 30% of dads have post-trauma symptoms in the exceeding clinical cutoffs. And if you look at kids with cancer for whom all the things are being done, it's in the 20s, right? So I think watching your child struggle and being unable to alleviate that is often more traumatic than being the one in the struggle. And I think sometimes we forget that siblings are watching that too. And so in a study by Kaplan, 60% of their siblings scored in the moderate to severe range for post-traumatic symptoms, with 22% meeting full criteria for PTSD. In other words, these kids looked like veterans or survivors of child abuse or survivors of a car accident or something. 1 in 5 kids were meeting criteria. Mental disabilities literature, again, we see similar patterns. In the UK, they did a study that found 14% of older siblings of a child with just a general intellectual disability had adjustment problems, so that's about a 1.5 time risk. Siblings of children with intellectual delays are at greater risk for psychological and social difficulties. And again, these are modified by lots of environmental factors. And then finally, in the autism studies, and again, it's hard to find comparison groups for Prader-Willi because in some ways, right, they are like the chronically ill kids, especially early in life. And in some ways, some of our kids are more like the kids with intellectual disabilities, and for our kids with behavior problems, autism can be a good comparison. And again, we see the same pattern. Siblings of children with autism have more psychological, behavioral, and social problems than their peers. About 40% of siblings in this group develop significant challenges. And the thing I think is important, we're going to give an and message. My experience of Prader-Willi is it's a journey of extremes, right? Extreme joy, extreme fear, extreme humor, extreme frustration. And think that's part of the context for families. But most of siblings develop what we call internalizing disorders, anxiety or depression, those hypervigilance symptoms of trauma. And what we were finding in our support groups, and we'll talk about in our qualitative studies, is lots of our kids, it's just not visible. Just parents in general of all children aren't very good at picking up symptoms of anxiety or depression. And we were hearing in our siblings, my mom and dad have so much on their plate, I don't want to burden them by telling them I'm anxious all the time. So we were hearing a lot of kids kind of keeping it to themselves. The more aggressive the child with autism, the more the typically developing sibling struggled. Even though, and in this study it was really interesting, siblings could say, I know that's the autism. That's not my brother or sister. That's not me. It's the autism that's making them act like that. That cognition didn't modify their adjustment. They still were anxious, right? They still were at risk. So the question is, do we expect Prader-Willi to be different? And I would say yes, because the child with Prader-Willi has these intense and complex health needs and developmental needs and behavioral concerns. And those change across the lifetime, right? So you work so hard in infancy and toddlerhood to get your kiddo to eat, to get your kiddo to speak. And then you hit the years where they're talking all the time and they want food all the time. And so the world kind of turns upside down. And for us as adults, it often takes us by surprise, right? Like, oh my gosh, like, if I get up to talk and now I can't get up to stop. But for a child, they don't have the emotional, cognitive, moral kind of resources to make sense of that in the way that we do. So all they know is the world is super unpredictable, right? So this changing over time, the demands occur in multiple places, right? It's not like it's, again, food's everywhere, so it's tough. And there are 2 studies on siblings and children with Prader-Willi, and in those 2 studies, they both reported that siblings who have siblings with PWS, they have a harder time than siblings whose siblings have Down syndrome or other kinds of disorders. And then for me, this is an incredibly unusual finding. Again, there's only 1 study, so it would be interesting to replicate it. But the thing that's striking and maybe was initially disheartening was these risks aren't modified by parenting style or attachment style per se. So the child can have, and that almost never happens. Usually we see insecurely attached kids suffering much more than like securely attached or securely bonded kids. And what we found what they found in this study was that even kids with really secure attachments to their parents were still at greater risk for anxiety and depression. So again, there are very few studies,
As children, we are each in our own normal universe. Our experiences are our reality. When Jane and I got older, we realized that how we grew up was not normal, that living with PWS isn't normal. Our childhood was overshadowed by Prader-Willi syndrome. We weren't just Kate's older sisters, we were caregivers. By the time we were old enough to be self-aware, we began to realize the effect that growing up with Kate had on our lives.
Siblings need more support when growing up with a sibling with Prader-Willi syndrome. And we thought, who better to support siblings than other siblings? So with the help of Dr. Bennett Murphy, we started a support group for these siblings. After we witnessed the success of these measures, we wanted to expand our efforts. To better understand the effects and more effectively support these siblings, we decided to conduct a study focusing on the impact of Prader-Willi syndrome on siblings, a previously under-researched topic. This research gathered both quantitative and qualitative data by utilizing both survey and interviewing methods of data collection. Our quantitative survey was taken by one parent and the sibling closest in age to the family member with Prader-Willi syndrome. The quantitative surveys were sent through email and completed through the program SurveyMonkey. The next portion of information gathering was through interviews with all siblings aged 5 to 18 of the child with Prader-Willi syndrome. The interviews were conducted over the phone, and both the surveys and interviews were approved by the Institutional Review Board.
The parent survey was comprised of the Family Environmental Scale, which measures the family functioning and problems from the parent's point of view. The parent survey also included the Youth Outcome Questionnaire that the parent completed with the sibling closest in age to the child with PWS in mind. This questionnaire measures factors including intrapersonal distress, somatic symptoms, interpersonal relationships, social problems, and behavioral dysfunction. The last measure was the 14-item scale of general well-being that was taken by the parent regarding their own personal life experiences.
This survey was taken by the sibling aged 5 to 18 who is closest in age to the family member with Prader-Willi syndrome. The survey consisted of the positive and negative affect scale for children that had the sibling rate how often they experience certain emotions. The survey also included the Connor-Davidson resilience scale that had the sibling rate how often they exhibit resilient thoughts and behaviors. The last measure was the child report of post-traumatic stress symptoms that marked how often the siblings displayed various symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder.
The qualitative interviews were about 30 minutes long and consisted of 17 guiding questions about various aspects of life and growing up with a sibling with Prader-Willi syndrome. We interviewed a total of 31 participants, mostly residing in Utah and neighboring states. Examples of these questions include, what is it like for you being a sibling to your brother or sister with Prader-Willi syndrome? Do you have friends over to your house? What are your feelings toward your brother or sister with Prader-Willi syndrome? And what are some good things about being a sibling to someone with Prader-Willi syndrome?
You just want to be normal. I love being a sibling, but I feel bad all the time. I feel useless if I'm not involved in helping her calm down. I feel guilty asking for attention because she needs it more. These are quotes from siblings in our qualitative interviews. There are so many emotions that come with being a sibling to someone with Prader-Willi syndrome. And the emotions come in extremes, extreme highs and extreme lows. The most common negative emotions we found the siblings experience are frustration, guilt, anger, embarrassment, loneliness, and anxiousness. Living with someone with Prader-Willi syndrome is hard. The experiences, the explosions, and even the daily hassles of the syndrome bring extreme emotions. Children with siblings with Prader-Willi syndrome usually lack the emotional maturity or understanding to cope with their situation. If these children don't have the protective factors in their lives that enable resiliency, the trauma from growing up with Prader-Willi syndrome will have serious consequences that will stay with them as adults. For me, the damage presented itself when I was 15 and diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder from living with Kate. Things were bad for me. I had crippling anxiety and could not even handle being in the same room as Kate. Growing up, I did not have the skills or supports to handle the traumatic experiences that Kate brought. But not all siblings are affected the same way.
Just as Jane was describing, I felt all these extreme emotions, but I bottled them up and pushed them deeper and deeper within the dusty recesses where I never cared to discover. I'm still working on uncovering these buried emotions. Guilt is one that I've started addressing. At home, I would feel all of these emotions, but when I would leave to escape, I felt guilty and selfish. I didn't set healthy boundaries for myself to ensure that I could cope with the volatile environment. I did not talk to anyone about how I was feeling. The lack of an outlet led to a buildup of resentment, of myself, of Kate, and of my family. However, there's no one to blame. As one sibling said, negative feelings come a lot, but I separate my sister and her disorder. I will blame the PWS and not her. I don't like the disability, but I love my sister. This sentiment is easy to say, but the distinction is not easily internalized for siblings. It is almost impossible for me to effectively attribute my feelings to the situation rather than Kate or my family. And while appreciating the differences between my sister and her syndrome, this does not simplify or ameliorate the complicated relationship or the damaging emotions. I kept a lot of resentment and frustration inside of me because I didn't see the necessity of opening up. I get angry at Kate but feel guilty when I do, so I keep it to myself instead of finding solutions. I am grateful for what she adds to the family. It is impossible not to love her. When he's happy, we're happy. She can always make me happier. Many of the interviewed siblings made these types of comments. Although Prader-Willi brings a lot of intense negative emotions, there are also strong positive emotions experienced. Many siblings noted often experiencing gratitude, pride, and happiness. Prader-Willi is not all bad. In fact, when we siblings get together, we share an endless supply of laughter and funny stories, which reinforce how much we love and enjoy our siblings. For example, a few years ago, when Kate and I were a little younger, she was choosing her dessert for the day and came to the conclusion that she wanted peaches and ice cream. Mind you, this was a Prader-Willi decision, so there wasn't a lot of flexibility on my end not to meet that desire. And so I looked in the pantry, and to my horror, I saw that we had run out of peaches. As I walked back toward where Kate was sitting in her special chair, I tried to find the words to be able to mitigate her outburst as I told her that we didn't have peaches for what she wanted for dessert. And so I finally broke it to her, and to my surprise, she actually, she wasn't angry, and she very matter-of-factly told me this. She said, "That's okay, Emma. We can just make peaches. We have the internet." We have a deep love for our siblings with PWS. These kids can make us truly happy. Most siblings are extremely loyal and protective of their brothers and sisters. They have a different way of seeing the world, and each time I catch a glimpse through Kate's eyes, I only see goodness and purity.
My favorite story of Kate is one night I had snuck into her room to retrieve one of the many items she had stolen from me that day, and as I dug through her piles and piles of random items, I found the thing I was looking for when I heard Kate's footsteps in the hallway approaching her room, and in a desperate attempt to avoid a nasty explosion, I jumped into her bed and pretended to be asleep, naturally, and braced for Kate's reaction. When I heard Kate come into her room, she grabbed her iPad off of the nightstand. She pulled the covers up over me, kissed me on my cheek, and left.
She is the royalty, and we are her servants. I wouldn't want a life without him. We found that the siblings' relationship with their brother or sister with Prader-Willi were very complex. It's a love-hate relationship. Almost all the siblings we interviewed have an intense love for and a dear relationship with their sibling with Prader-Willi. A lot of the siblings described it as their most special and precious relationship. 90% of interviewed siblings said they enjoyed being with their sibling with Prader-Willi. However, this relationship is usually the most painful. One interesting phenomenon we found was that there's usually one sibling who the Prader-Willi kid got along with well and who would take care of the Prader-Willi kid. Then there was a sibling who would tease the Prader-Willi sibling and had a more distant and volatile relationship.
For our family, Emma was the one who Kate loved and would always want to have help her and play with her. Kate had a weekly ritual growing up of ranking our family members, and she always ranked Emma number 1 in our family, and she would rank me 9th in our family of 7. I was the one who would tease her. My go-to was to sneak up behind her and softly whisper in her ear, "I'm going to burn your Barbies," which were her most prized possessions. I had a very rocky relationship with Kate. Looking back and through this research, we have found that with me and these other siblings, we provoke our sibling with Prader-Willi so that we know when the explosions are going to happen. It is a coping mechanism, though not a very healthy one, that gives these siblings a tiny bit of control. We found as these triggering siblings age, they mature and have better control over their feelings and can start to have a positive relationship with their sibling with Prader-Willi. It happened for me when I was 16. I was finally able to control my feelings and use healthy coping mechanisms instead of provoking Kate to deal with the stress. I can happily say that I am now ranked 4th in our family.
However, being the favored one also comes with its challenges. I could not leave the house while Kate was near the door without inciting a jealous outburst of questions and concerns from Kate. I would continually have to sneak in and out of my own home to attend activities such as school or soccer practice. Many times she would catch me and chase me to my car screaming and crying. I would have to sit with the doors locked until my mom would drag her back inside and I could escape. I was also the one she chose consistently to take her away from family outings when she would get bored or stressed. I would spend the evenings walking outside with Kate rather than participating in the experiences. Being favored added an overwhelming responsibility to my childhood. I worry about my sister's safety. She doesn't have common sense. She might wander off by herself. I always have to be aware. 10 eyes need to be on her at all times. It's stressful and it's straining. Safety is a pertinent consideration when living with someone with Prader-Willi, both the safety of the kid with Prader-Willi and the rest of the family. Kids with Prader-Willi get into trouble and do not have the necessary capacities that keep them safe. This can be very stressful for the rest of the family. 80% of the interviewed siblings claimed they worried about their siblings' safety often, and 48% often worried about the rest of their family's safety because of the sibling with Prader-Willi. In one of our family's attempts to replicate some semblance of normalcy, we decided to go for a hike, and midway through this hike, Kate got a little bit bored, and so she went off and leaving the rest of us. And I was the one who chased after her to make sure that she would be okay, separated from the family. And so we were walking along and we see this big group of people stopped on the path ahead. And Kate didn't pay them any mind and just started edging her way through them. And I got lost in the sea of people and wasn't able to find her quickly. When I finally did get to the front of the crowd, I saw what the commotion was about and was met face to face with this giant moose. And I got there just in time to see Kate sidling up to the moose and barreling past it. I had just learned at the time that moose are one of the most aggressive and dangerous animals around that area, and so I was understandably very frightened and panicked and frozen in fear, having no idea what to do in the situation. Luckily, Kate's rampage right past the moose didn't cause it any alarm, and it just kept eating peacefully, but it could have been a lot worse. And so I was able to take a large path and meet back up with Kate again, but it was definitely a scary situation. So many times the siblings' own safety is also at risk. 77% are often physically hurt by their sibling, sometimes leaving permanent damage.
It's all worth it. I don't like the disability, but I love her. We are more mature and handle things better. I can look at different ways to solve a problem. I'm thankful because he brings blessings and hardships. There are many valuable skills and attributes that siblings often obtain early in life from having a sibling with Prader-Willi. These include patience, responsibility, understanding, gratitude, and maturity. Life with Prader-Willi is extremely difficult, and these siblings are forced to adapt and mature in order to survive.
I find hope in looking forward to the possibility for growth and healing, but I also find hope in looking back at the hardships we have endured and the amazing experiences we have had. A common method for coping among siblings is humor and storytelling. One night, Jane and I were looking for a movie to watch, and we knew that Kate had stockpiled all of our loose DVDs somewhere in her room, probably in her closet, and so we went on a mission to retrieve one of those movies so that we could entertain ourselves for the night. And as we snuck in using a flashlight so as not to wake her, we found the stash in her closet, and we sat on her bed to start rifling through it to find one that interested us. And we were looking through them, and we finally found one that we could agree to watch together. And then we hear a creaking coming from across the room, somewhere around her couch area. And in the glow of the flashlight, we see Kate slowly turn around from where she was lying on the couch, and she, without completely facing us, she whispered these words, "Jane, you're sitting on the wet spot." And in a sudden realization, both of us jump off the bed, where now we knew she had peed the bed, and it finally makes sense why she would be sleeping on the couch instead of in her own bed.
So these scores up here at the top, the family scores, this is based on a mean of 50, and really anything 40 to 60 is normal. So families with Prader-Willi are not looking very different than your typical family. A little bit lower on cohesion, a little bit higher on control, but still within the expected, norm. Now, what's interesting though is the range. So if 40 to 60 is normal, 4 is like below the first percentile. And fewer families that are higher than average on cohesion. So one way some family adapt is like everybody, I'll take the kiddo with Prader-Willi, everybody go do your own thing. And so there's a risk, right? We're skewed a little bit lower toward cohesion, although many, many families adapt well, but it's something just to hold in mind. Conflict is on the higher end. Again, it just skewed high, huge variability from lower than typical levels, anything under 40, right? But from families who have conflict multiple times a day, daily. Organization is pretty average, but again, we just get these huge variabilities, and same with control. That's anything over 65 would be, or below like 35 would be considered statistically significant. So overall, families are doing well, but huge variability. And parent well-being, in this questionnaire, it's like, how much purpose do you have? How much do you find a sense of meaning? How much calmness do you experience? How content are you in your life? How satisfied are your relationships? We had one parent who wrote 0 on all of those things. But then we had other parents who found tremendous meaning, tremendous purpose, moments of calmness, great connection, right? So again, huge variability. In our kids, this, again, huge variability, it's like our story. But the thing I do want to note is this is below the U.S. average. And we know, there's a lot out there, right? We're worrying about America's youth and rates of anxiety, and rates of depression, and rates of sleeplessness. Living with a sibling who has Prader-Willi probably depletes resources a little bit. Our kids are a little bit less resilient, probably because they're spending resources, right? So if resilience is the ability to bounce back from adversity, but you're having these kind of micro adversities on a regular basis, that our kids kind of go into other challenges a little bit more depleted. And so what I would say as a psychologist, if other challenges arise, like parental divorce or difficulty in school, we want to rally our resources for our healthy kids faster, right? Like, yes, middle school is hard. Yes, high school is hard. And these kids are already kind of coping with something that not everybody's coping with on a daily basis. And so we want to be more proactive, I think, in nurturing and supporting our siblings. No, thank you. The encouraging piece is, if any of you know the Gottman work or some of the positive psychology research, this is a ratio of positive emotions to negative emotions. And our siblings were experiencing about 4.5 positive emotions for every 1 negative. And 5 to 1 is considered kind of the magic number in psychology. So like if you look at marriages that end in divorce versus marriages that succeed, there's actually not a difference in conflict or a difference in negativity. It's the ratio of positive to negative. So in couples that divorce, it's kind of 1 to 1, right? So every time we do something nice for each other, we also do something snarky or mean. But in marriages that last, you're getting 5 positive coming in for every 1 negative. So the good news is our siblings are looking pretty good in the sense of their ratios. We would expect that to be protective. And the piece, again, if you're like, well, what are my take homes besides being worried and now thinking about more people I need to take care of, is one really effective intervention is making sure that your siblings are getting positive interaction, not just neutral, but the activation of surprise, joy, delight, those kinds of things. Sibling distress, this was the YOQ. This is a parent-rated measure, huge variability. Just to give you some sense, if a child scores 45 or higher, it's considered clinically significant, and we generally refer for therapy. Our mean was 44. So most of our kids, the vast majority, are kind of at that clinical cutoff. Again, primarily for anxiety and depression. Our range is, again, huge. These kids, parents are saying they're never anxious, they're never naughty, they never argue, they always do what they're told, they always cooperate. I don't know who those kids are. There are alien babies. So, like, again, you would expect a score in the teens or 20s for a typical kid. So I actually worry about both the extremes. These, our high number kids are exhibiting a lot of outward distress, but those low-rated kids, there just aren't kids who never argue, right, or always cooperate. So I think sometimes there's that disconnect in children. Again, we talked about this in our scientific meeting, but the pressure to be the good kid when your parents are beleaguered. I'm the healthy one, I'm the well one, that's the kiddo that needs you, I'll manage. And I think we want to pay attention to those kids. They may be functioning exceedingly well in the world, and the question is, to whom do they talk on those hard days, right? To whom do they talk? And making sure they know, yes, sometimes I get sad, scared, overwhelmed, tired, and I'm your mama or your daddy too, and it's important that we talk about these things. Just a note, in this rating, 4 out of our 47, about 5% of kids were experiencing suicidal ideation, and that's pretty typical for national norms at this point. So it wasn't elevated. Again, if parents knew is the question. The piece that I worry about right here is 60% of the 47 kids that filled out our surveys are saying, I have trauma symptoms. 60%. And again, we're an interdisciplinary clinic. We have psychiatrists and psychologists in the clinic. We know our kids, we know our families. We have sibling events, we have family events. It was actually kind of interesting because, like, after we presented this at one point, they were saying they have these, like, we have a Christmas party every year, and then there's a summer event, and they have them without food, so, everybody can enjoy. And the siblings were saying, we never go off and get together. We hang with our family, or we talk to each other, or we watch our sibling with Prader-Willi, and we're not actually talking to the other siblings that are at this same gathering. And we began realizing how much of the family dynamic and the sibling dynamic is just organized around making sure that kiddo with Prader-Willi is safe. That even when they had these opportunities to connect, they weren't doing it necessarily. So anyway, this number alarms me from a for lots of reasons. But we heard it again and again in our support groups. Like, there are times I just go to my room and I'm anxious and I don't know why. I don't know why. I'm just keyed up and tense and anxious. And we heard that a lot from our kids. So just in our predictive models, the only thing that really predicted child trauma was that ratio of positive to negative emotions. So kids who had a lower ratio and were having more negative emotions, they were more vulnerable to trauma. Again, that's fixable. This was interesting, but family, organization, and control were the two biggest that predicted overall distress. Pardon me. Now, family organization, that is everybody kind of having a clear role, like here's when we do our chores, here's when we do our homework, here's what you're in charge of. That was protective. But high levels of family control, kind of rigid adherence to rules, actually put siblings more at risk. And I think when you know, some of our kids with Prader-Willi have real difficulty with transitions, with uncertainty, and are quite rigid themselves. And that imposition of rigidity on a healthy developing child can actually put them at risk for being more anxious or more depressed, right? Especially if there are lots of these kind of idiosyncratic rules, I guess. And parent well-being was related most strongly to family cohesion, time together, and the positive emotions of the healthy siblings. So when families were cohesive and they had opportunities to do things together, and siblings were feeling happier, parents, that was related to parent well-being. We don't know the direction of effect, whether it starts with the parents or starts with the kid. I think the important thing to kind of our take homes, and then we'll open it up for discussion. There is no one family environment. Like I think Jane and Emma illustrate so beautifully. Your different kids are going to experience your family and your child with Prader-Willi differently based on lots of things: their temperament, their age, their gender, the age at which they were when the child with Prader-Willi was born, etc. The other thing is they're just temperamental differences. So in the resilience literature, psychologists talk a lot about the dandelion versus the orchid. Dandelion kids are like dandelions, right? Dandelions thrive wherever, they grow up between concrete, right? They don't need the most nurturing of environments. They just grow where it's planted. Orchids, on the other hand, these are often highly perceptive, highly intelligent, highly sensitive, creative kids are very attuned to their environment. And when there is stress around, they're more vulnerable, right? I think of them as kind of being more permeable or having a thinner skin. So the stress of others, they're taking it in. The distress of their siblings, of their family members. So the challenge for us is families exist to support the development of all members, including yourself. And I will say, when I say to parents, it's super important that you take care of yourself. I always think what the parents are hearing is like a Snoopy. Because I get that smile and nod, like, yeah, whatever. And so, like, when do I schedule an appointment for? But this is not, again, it's that old oxygen mask on the airplane. If you don't put your oxygen mask on first, you're going to pass out before you can give it to your kids, and then you're all passed out. That's no good. So when resources are limited, we do have to triage in some ways. What do I need? What do my healthy siblings need? What does my kiddo with PWS need? And how are we going to find some workable balance for that? And again, I love the concept of stewardship. So again, if you're at the resilience, individual relationships are important, making sure you have them, making sure siblings have them. And we'll go through like what the kids told us they wish their parents knew, because we asked, what do you wish your parents knew? Or what do parents need to be doing to support your development? You tell us, and we'll tell them. Overwhelmingly, the number one response was, I wish I had more time with mom or dad. I wish I had more time with them. And I think what often happens, again, it comes from a good place as parents. We're super protective of our child with Prader-Willi. They're vulnerable. If your child with Prader-Willi also has some of the behavioral or psychiatric pieces where they're acting out, there's also a piece of, I don't want anyone else to have to deal with an outburst or the running away. So I'll stay with the kiddo. with Prader-Willi, and I'll send the siblings to grandma or neighbors or whatever. But the experience from that child's perspective is you always choose them and you always send me. And overwhelmingly what they would say is, could we just have an afternoon or a night with just me and mom or just me and dad, or have a little vacation where the child with Prader-Willi is at camp or at grandma's and it's a special trip for them, and we go away on vacation where we can just go into a buffet and eat. Oh my gosh, this is what I hear all the time. Can we please go to Chakarama or a buffet? I think I'm growing up deprived of Chakarama, you know? So finding those individual relationships, both within the family and without the family, making sure, again, if your friend, you know, if your kiddos you notice don't have friends over, working to solve that, like, hey, I'll take, you know, your sibling with Prader-Willi, and why don't you have an afternoon and let the team hang out here or whatever. Strengthening positive emotions and again encouraging humor. I think it's what we adore about Jane and Emma Thornton is they can laugh about sitting in pee and being barely surviving. Moose are angry. If you don't know, they're dangerous. They're angry, bitter creatures. You know, or the story of a sister running away and in her bathing suit, running down the middle of a busy street. You know, and like how scary that is, though, when you were swimming with your sister and then she's gone. Right? So how do we cope with humor, but recognizing it's hard? So we want to build the positive, and we want to address, we have to accept and recognize the distress. It is embarrassing when your kiddo loses it in the grocery store, right? Your healthy sibling, and many of us are like, okay, I just need to move on. I need to get out of the store, make dinner, and let's go. This healthy sibling may need to hear from you, whew, that was unfortunate, that was rough, like, I want to do that again, because it gives them permission to feel, and I think what we've often heard was, I'm angry, but I feel guilty because I know they're not trying to do it, right? Or I'm angry at my parent for not getting on my sibling for hitting me, but getting on me for hitting them, or whatever. Like, I think we need to talk about it, because once you put it in words, the kiddo can work with it. The kids that really struggle is there's a huge meltdown and then life goes on as if nothing happened. And again, the idea that that's normal, it's still hard. It's still hard. So allowing expressions of negative emotions, and honestly, all you need to do is hear it. You don't have to excuse the child with Prader-Willi. You just have to say, yes, that was scary. Yes, that was frustrating. Some days are hard. Right, so allow those expressions of negative emotions, listen and debrief, and then you can say, and you know what, I thought it was super wise you just walked away and let us handle it. That was smart. Or I know I lost my cool when you were trying to help, and I know you were trying to help. I know your intentions were good, and I'm sorry I was stressed and I lost my cool. And that wasn't helpful to me, to you, or to our kiddo with Prader-Willi. I think the more we can talk about it, then kids, again, you know, I'll hear parents or kids say, like, I snuck out of the house because goodbyes with my sibling or my child with Prader-Willi are so bad. They're so, you know, the child gets so upset when we leave. Like, poor Emma can't walk out of the house without keep crying and chasing her and holding on to her. And so sometimes people sneak out and then they feel guilty. And so I was, like, in a session at clinic with a mom who's like, I had to sneak out. And I was like, that's a healthy adaptation. Right? Like, that was just an adaptation. It's okay. She's like, well, I feel sneaky and manipulative and dishonest. I was like, you're surviving and your kiddo's okay. You know, if you can say goodbye, great. And if you're not into it that day, okay, sneak out. You know, like, give yourself some compassion for that grace to try to survive. And then we do think we need to find professionals when needed. And I always cringe when I say this because I know how many professionals y'all have to see, right? I hate to say another appointment, but it could be someone in your community, someone in your school, but get your kiddo that support. Again, they may not want to hurt you, they may not want to burden you, and so sometimes having someone else to talk to can be super helpful. That said, you're going to find, to your frustration, a lot of therapists don't know what PWS is. And so you may need to reach out to like the medical advisory committee here, you know, like I talk to therapists all the time about here's what the condition is, here's how I understand it, here's what I see, because siblings often can't name it. They can't name, I come home from school and I'm like this because I'm wondering if, my sibling's gonna have a tantrum, or I left the food out and I forgot to relock the pantry. I was rushing to get a snack before I went, and my sibling binged, and I could have killed them. And they've already been yelled at by the parent. It's hard to go back and say, I feel like I can't work through this. I could have killed my sibling. And we have siblings holding that kind of anxiety. So sometimes a professional is just helpful because they're outside the dynamic. Working with medical systems, educational systems to find those connections for your children. Again, the Thorntons have built this beautiful, this was an annual retreat, which we're going to do every year, held up at the National Ability Center in Park City. And these are all siblings who came up and did ropes courses and rode horses and went on hikes and just laughed together. And then we did like an hour and a half kind of support group where I came in and they could talk about some of the challenges and funny stories and favorite memories and heartbreak, etc. The other thing is I think you need to make sure you tell your pediatricians and primary care providers, hey, when you do the annual checkup on my healthy kiddo, screen them for anxiety and depression for me. I'll step out, screen them. Physicians and pediatricians, we're trained to screen for things like child abuse, domestic violence, things that are known adverse childhood events that can put a kid at risk for trauma. Most pediatricians will not think having a sibling with Prader-Willi puts your kiddo at risk, but it does. And so they need to be routinely following up with your healthy kiddos so that they can catch it early. And did you guys